Professor Applebaum has kindly agreed to drive in from Santa Barbara this afternoon, today, to talk with us. And as I was looking through his credentials and his resume online, he's Professor Emeritus at UC Santa Barbara. He has been in the Sociology Department and co-founder of the Global Studies and International Development.
Global and International Studies.
It is a program that Ms. Graham is a graduate of. And as I was looking through his accomplishments and his publications and the work that he's been doing, and I was just telling him this personally, he's the kind of academic, the kind of professor that I dreamed about being when I was your age. Maybe a little older than you.
My life
took a twist and turn, and I ended up in administration because I couldn't get a faculty job where I wanted to live, and I wanted to live in LA. And so I stayed. But his work is absolutely top-notch academic. He is well recognized and renowned in his field, and he does good things as a result of his research and changes the world, which is really one of the themes of our education here. And he may not know the extent to which his work and the work of the department that he developed at UC Santa Barbara has shaped the curriculum that you experience every day. When we were developing AUP, before we hired Ms. Graham, we hired as a consultant one of his former students, Chris, to develop sort of a roadmap for what global studies would look like. Chris went on to a different job. We hired Ms. Graham. She came in, and really global studies has become a major thread running through everything you do. So when we talk about AUP and the tagline being understanding the world and changing it, Dr. Applebaum has done exactly that.
Thank you for that most gracious introduction. So let me just say a word about University of California, Santa Barbara. Can you all hear me back there? Is this okay? No microphone, no amplification. We created the Global and International Studies program. We call it Global and International because, in our view, international is a relationship between countries, between nation states, the world that I was born into. Global is a world of the transnational, as perhaps you've studied here. Things that happen across borders, such as the things I'll be talking about today. And to me, this is a very challenging and exciting time to be alive, and a little frightening to be looking at all this, because we see a great tug of war between these two great forces, the international and the transnational, or the global. Our program now has 1,300 undergraduate majors at UCSB. It's very popular. And when those of you who are juniors graduate year after next, I expect you'll all be applying to UCSB. Is that correct? It's really a great program. You should seriously consider it. We've created a consortium of global studies programs around the world. There are now probably 100 such programs in that consortium. And it's becoming an accepted field. It grows out of many different disciplines. My training is in sociology, but it really embraces everything. So I welcome this opportunity, and I thank Felicia especially for connecting me up here. So you're from all over the world, I take it. How many of you are, how can I put this? How many of you were born in the U.S.? So roughly half of you. I'm not going to go through the whole roster. We'll do it in a different way in a little bit. But I'm going to talk a lot about China and Bangladesh. How many of you are from mainland China? One student. So you could be honest. Oh,
Three.
Four.
Over here.
Their hands are very low.
So if I say anything that's wrong, you're going to stop. Anyone from Bangladesh here? No. Okay, so we're going to start. I'm going to talk about clothing. That's not because I'm stylish, as you can tell, but because I'm interested in where the things we buy are made. And clothing is the most globalized industry in the world. because it is fairly easy to make. It can be made anywhere, and pretty much every country now makes the clothing that we consume. So we're going to start with a little exercise. Turn to the person next to you and look at the label on the back of their shirt or how many of you wish that you could wash your t-shirt? Okay, so let's just see, where did this come from? How many, the label tells you where the item of clothing was put together and exported to the U.S. As we'll see, there are many parts of even an item of clothing that can be made in different countries, but they're ultimately sewn together in one place. And under U.S. trade laws, we have to label it. So, China, how much was made in China? Not sure. How about Taiwan? Taiwan's a little higher end. How about the United States? How many were made in the good old U.S.? Just one? Wow. Anyone else? Aha. How about the Philippines? That's where my jacket was made. Philippines. How about Bangladesh? Bangladesh. What other countries? How about, let's see, you're all, this is a global program. So if I say Central America or the Caribbean, you all know which countries those are, right? Which countries are
Central America?
Yeah.
It's like around Haiti, I know this on the spot.
I know. Well, let's start with Central America. Then it'll be like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica. I wasn't sure that I would remember. So, how many in any of those countries? How about Haiti? Dominican Republic. Where else? Vietnam. How many Vietnam? There you go. Okay, well, I will continue this, but...
I have Indonesia.
Where?
Yeah.
Indonesia.
Indonesia. How many Indonesia?
One more Indonesia.
Okay, well, what we're going to do now is take a little tour and explore some of these issues. But let me just ask you one question. Why do you think clothing is made in so many different countries? Take out a paper and pencil. There will be an exam on this. Seriously, anyone want to wager your guess? Yes.
That's where they have the resources.
They have the resources to make it. All right.
How much people are willing to make it for?
Pardon?
How much people are willing to make it for?
Okay.
Well, labor is cheap.
Labor is cheap.
Well, first for labor, but also some countries do it for the self-sustaining. They're not so evolutionized in creating it today. So that's like a good major part of what it happened.
Okay, well, I'm going to do my entire talk. Yes?
There are a lot of people in these countries, and maybe education level is really low, so they can find other jobs.
Right.
Yeah, and they are ready to work there.
Right, so wages are cheap, people need to work, there aren't many options, people aren't as educated and so forth. Let's run through this a little more systematically. So the story I'm about to tell is a troubling story, but I'm going to hopefully end on a more hopeful note. So, by the way, I pulled this off your website. How many of you read the book Liddy? So Liddy's a great book. I'd recommend it. It's a slim book. And it's a story about a girl who was on a farm in Vermont, and because of the poverty in the 19th century, she wound up working in a factory in Lowell, Massachusetts, depicted there, which is where the garment industry began in the United States 150 years or so ago. Textile industry. Lots of girls, and I say girls, young girls, 14, 15 years old, which, as we'll see, remains true today. So the garment industry historically has been a place where women have found work. And the women in the world today make most of the clothing that we wear. So I put up this because child labor. I raised the question, is that a 19th century problem? Now, since I raised the question, you must know what the answer is. Is it a 19th century problem?
Not specifically.
Not specifically. That's very cautious, actually. 170 million children, that is to say children under the age of 16, work in factories around the world, making clothing not just for us in the United States, but everywhere in the world. And certainly the clothing is consumed in wealthy countries in Europe, in Japan, Australia, and now even in China, now that China has developed a large middle-class population. So child labor is common today in the apparel industry. But it's not only factories where children work. What are these children doing here? They're separating garbage, that's right. So when we recycle, throw all of our stuff in those blue, green, and whatever colored bins, hopefully they go to some center and some machine separates them, but not perfectly. And so as a result, people ultimately do the separation, and a lot of the stuff is now sent overseas to poor countries where children do the work on mountains of basically of garbage. What are these children doing? That's right, they're sorting cigarettes into packages. And, how old do you think that child is? Maybe 7, 8 years old, something like that. Cotton harvesting, a very toxic business because of the various types of pesticides that are used in cotton. This could be Uzbekistan, which is a big cotton exporting country. Again, child labor. So part of what I want to communicate to you is when you go into, well, I don't know, where do you shop for clothing? Where? Gap? Anyone shop at Gap? Well, yeah, that's a model of that. Let's see. How about Walmart? H&M? We're going to come back to these companies in a minute. But when you go and buy something which is, nice plastic, package, which is hanging on a shelf, all of this is insulated from it. But everything we've looked at, from the cotton to the fabric that's made, to the various parts that are sewn together and then exported, ultimately, I know this is an obvious point to make, but it's an obviously easy point to forget. Everything we consume is made by human hands, somewhere in the world. In the 19th century, those hands were down the street. And actually, as we'll see in a minute, they're not so far from here still. But mostly now, they're offshore, where we don't see them. So when we buy something which seems clean, sanitary, safe, it's important to look back on what's called the supply chain, the various hands that made whatever we're consuming. And I'm focusing on clothing, but the same is true with this computer, with pretty much anything we buy today. Somewhere along the line, people worked on it. I won't show this video in the interest of time, but this was a young woman, not this woman here, a woman reporter got into this factory in Bangladesh. I'll talk about Bangladesh in just a moment. And under the guise of being, a starving young Bangladeshi woman, she was actually a journalist, a reporter, and her supervisor was 9 years old on this assembly line, making clothing. So I've put here some of the principal places where clothing is made in the world today. It's made in every country pretty much. But the main countries currently, China remains the largest maker of clothing in the world today. Because China has 1.1 or 1.2 billion people. While it has a large middle class population, there are lots of people looking for work. They flock to the east coast of China, which is the world's factory, where everything from computers to clothing are assembled. So China remains the world's factory, although that is rapidly changing. Number 2 is now Bangladesh. A lot of clothing manufacturers moving from China to Bangladesh. Why do you think that is? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Yes.
Well, because China has a really bad pollution level right now, and they have pollution level.
Bad what?
Like air
Pollution?
pollution, yeah. So many factories had to stop working because the Chinese government was putting a lot of taxes on them, and therefore many of them had to move to nearby countries.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That could be, I hadn't heard that, although it's plausible. You're on the right track, though. Something the government has done in China has made production move increasingly out of China. Anyone else want to try? Let me start with a different question. Imagine for a moment that you are the chief executive officer of the Gap, okay? And you're competing with H&M. And H&M just cut its prices. What are you going to do?
Cut your prices.
And how do you cut your prices? How can you afford to stay in business if you cut your prices?
Yeah.
You have to cut your costs. What is one of the major costs what is one of the costs in making clothing?
Labor.
That's right, wages for labor. So, yes?
Yeah, I just want to, that doesn't always work. Some other companies do the opposite. They increase their price to make it look like, or at least to make the people think that their products are better. That's why they're more expensive.
Well, that certainly is true. There's a lot of research that shows sometimes if you charge more for something, people will buy it because they think it's better, even if it's not. There's actually been a lot of research on wine consumption about that, but I'm not okay, so, well, let me answer my own question. One of the main reasons that production is leaving China and going to Vietnam and Bangladesh is that labor is more expensive in China. Wages are going up in China. And wages are going up, and this is to your point, because the government of China, especially in Guangdong province on the east coast of China, has raised wages partly in response to worker unrest, workers complaining about wages, and partly because China, now it's becoming middle class, wants people to be able to spend on Chinese goods. So there's partly demand from a growing middle class for higher wages, and partly a concern with workers being unhappy about low wages, and partly a changing strategy on the part of the Chinese government to make people wealthier so they can spend money in China and grow the Chinese economy. It's another topic that I work on, but which I won't go into, but just to mention it. So other places, Uzbekistan, Egypt, India, of course, Thailand, Vietnam's not on that map, but Vietnam is another major country which is exporting clothing. Let me explain this concept of exporting clothing for a moment. So when you look at the label and it says made in China, that doesn't mean that a Chinese designer is designing clothing and making it and selling it in the U.S. It means that a U.S. brand such as Gap is designing clothing, having it made in China, and then sent to the U.S. because it's cost effective to do that. I want to mention that because of the point you raised about pollution. This is sort of off topic, but since it popped into my head, I'll say it anyhow. You know, right now there are these climate talks going on in Paris. Do you talk about that at all in your classes? Great. The COP, so-called COP21 talks. China has now surpassed the United States as the world's leading polluter of greenhouse gases. Now that's misleading because there are many more Chinese than Americans. So as individuals, on a per person basis, we pollute more than China. But China is a big problem. But Chinese leaders say, but wait a second, we're polluting because your companies have moved their factories to China. And it's those factories that are creating pollution. So what the US and Europe and Japan have done is they've offshored their production and they've offshored their pollution. You follow me on this? It's companies like Gap and Walmart that are making stuff abroad that is responsible for the pollution in China. I'm not letting China off the hook. I'm just pointing out the global nature of this. So let me take you on a quick series of pictures just to give you a sense of what factories look like in various places. Pakistan, Cambodia. You know, all these factories are similar in some ways. They're all hot, they're crowded. It's almost entirely female workforce, at least in the sewing machines. There are men in the packing division and things of that sort. How many of you have ever been in a garment factory? This would not be on the exam. Where were you in a garment factory?
Downtown Los Angeles.
Right, excellent. So I'll come to that in just a minute. Garment factories are noisy. They're hard places to work. Even the best factories are places where the women burn out very quickly because of the stress of the work. And basically, most women are paid on a piecework basis. That is to say, how many items you can produce. Without getting into a lot of detail, there's a system called the bundle system where people will be sewing collars or putting buttons on, and then it goes to another place. Eventually the panels are sewn together, and typically at the end of long production lines, there's a board which indicates how many units of sweaters or shirts are being produced each hour. So there's a lot of pressure to meet quotas, and if you're paid by the piece, there's a lot of pressure to speed up your work to make more money in this industry. Haiti, another place in the Caribbean, and Los Angeles. I spent 10 years studying the Los Angeles garment industry with a colleague from UC Riverside in Abundance, who wrote a book called Behind the Label. We actually created a commission which looked at this, which took testimony from the brands and the workers' unions and things of that sort. And not far from here in the garment district, at one time there were 150,000 garment workers making clothing. Most of those workers were undocumented. That is to say, they were unlawful migrants from Mexico, Guatemala, Central America, making clothing. And why do you think Los Angeles became a center of garment production? Garment production used to be on the East Coast, Lowell, Massachusetts. Then it was New York City, which was a garment center, workers in the garment center in New York City. This was in the early 20th century. And then it moved to California after World War II. Why do you think it moved from New York City to California, garment sewing? I'll give you a clue. Why did it move from China to Bangladesh?
Because California was not that developed at that time, probably.
Right, it was cheaper. In New York City, in the 1920s and 30s, garment workers formed labor unions. And those unions got them certain rights, including a decent wage, decent working hours. So the industry responded by moving to places there weren't unions. One was the U.S. South, and the other was Los Angeles. Los Angeles was actually Mexico and Central America, because the workers, as I said, in Los Angeles, were from Mexico and Central America. As undocumented workers, they had very few rights. A worker without papers is not like to go and complain about working conditions for fear of being deported. So it was a place for businesses to go take advantage of low costs. And when we did the research in Los Angeles, we found out that the wages were typically below legal minimum wages, and workers were required to work longer hours. And how many of you have heard of Guess Jeans? Is that some popular guess? So Guess Jeans was a major brand in Los Angeles. They used factories in Los Angeles, and when workers tried to unionize those factories, Guess moved its production to a place near Puebla in Mexico, where there were no unions and where wages were lower. So there's always this kind of cat and mouse situation. So let me talk a little bit about China and Bangladesh. For this is a sophisticated audience, so you don't need to know this is a part of China, this area here in Guangdong province, which is has been the world's factory for electronics, clothing, pretty much everything, although now production is spread throughout China. And this is Bangladesh way over here. Bangladesh, a low-lying country, which is threatened by sea rise because of global warming. And as I said before, production's moved from China to Bangladesh because wages are much lower and working conditions, as we'll see, are much worse. So here's a factory in China. As you can see, relative to the factories we've seen, it's fairly decent. That is to say, it's not overly crowded, seems to be well lit. And I've been in factories in China that, conform to reasonable labor standards. And conditions in China have improved. Bangladesh is a different story. The factories that I've been in there tend to be hot, overcrowded, and much like the earlier pictures that I showed you, our workers are sort of on top of each other with bundles of clothing lying around. And here's another sense, I'll give you a sense. Typically, many workers will share a single room. Here's another photograph of that. Here are workers somewhere in probably the Sabah district in Dhaka.
How did you get into the factories in China and Bangladesh?
How did I get into the factories? Well, I obviously couldn't pass as a worker, a Chinese or Bangladesh worker. So in China, we got into factories because my wife Karen here at the time, a graphic designer, was doing logos for companies like Quicksilver. And so if you connect up with the brand, then you can go in with their quality control people. So when I was doing research initially in China, it was for that avenue. I had good connections with the Gap at the time, still do actually through one of our former students, Dan Fibiger. And they were quite happy to let us into their factory. So I would get on a boat, cross the Pearl River, go to some factory and take notes. Bangladesh was different. 2 years ago I was invited by the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturer and Exporters Association, which is a group of all the factory owners that runs the country. And they wanted to show that Bangladesh was doing the right thing for reasons I'll get into in a minute. So I was invited as an expert to go and attend this huge event that they had at their National Event Center to showcase the industry. And as part of that deal, they got me to some factories, but also my labor contacts there for the Worker Rights Consortium got me into factories also. But your point is well taken. I'll give you an example of what not to do. When I was researching the garment industry in Los Angeles, I went down with a couple of students and we decided just to randomly walk into a factory to see what was going on. So we walked into this Korean-owned factory, and immediately the entire workforce left through the back door. Why do you think they did?
Immigration.
That's right, they thought we were migration. We walk in with our clipboards and I felt terrible because because those workers would then dock their pay. So that was a little lesson in how not to do research. Okay, here's another quiz. How many of you wear athletic shoes for any purpose? Very athletic. How many of you wear Nikes? Ooh, impressive. How about Asics? Those are the real tracks. How about Converse? Some of you put your hands up several times, you have a whole closet full of different. What else we got? New Balance. Great shoe, multiple width. I like New Balance. Adidas. How can I forget Adidas? I don't get it. Many of you keep raising your hand. Will work these companies. So, who makes these shoes? Nike, New Balance. How about Nike? All of you know about Niemeyer, right? He's the superstar, $1 million athlete for Nike. Does Nike make its own shoes? I just did that so I can dramatically. So let me tell you how this works, okay? This is the theoretical part of this talk. It's not actually very theoretical, but I want to get your attention. So this is what's called a supply chain. And I think it's important to understand because this is how the world operates today. So at the top of the supply chain is you. You're the consumer. You buy things, right? Okay, so without you, there is no supply chain for shoes or for anything. So let's take an example. You decide to buy the ever-popular Nike brand. Okay, so you then have made Nike the most profitable and the largest shoe manufacturer in the world today. Nike is very, very successful. Nike doesn't make anything. Well, it might make some models to try out, but Nike does not make any athletic shoes that it sells. Those shoes are made in what are called contract factories or contractors. They are independently owned factories around the world that Nike hires to make its shoes. And I'm using Nike as an example, but what I'm saying can apply to anything that you buy today. As I said, from computers to clothing, to pretty much anything. Okay, so consumer places an order with a brand. The brand then fulfills that order with an independently owned contract factory. And the factory then employs the workers around the world. So just take the Nike example. The factories that Nike uses are owned by a family, the Pao Chen family. How many of you are familiar with Pao Chen? Then perhaps you know it better by the name under which it's traded, I think on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, Yuan. That's interesting because 1 out of every 6 branded athletic shoes sold in the world today is made by Pao Chen. Let me repeat that. 1/6 of all the shoes you buy, whether it's Nike, Adidas, Converse, Reebok, whatever, is made in a Pao Chen factory. So I was also in a factory in China, Pao Chen factory. So let me tell you that story. So there I went with Karen and with Nelson Lichtenstein, who's professor at UCSB, and his wife Eileen Boris. And I managed to finagle through contacted Nike an invitation to visit one of their suppliers in Dongguan, which is in Guangdong province in southern China. And we went to the factory. This is the entrance to the factory. Now, when I say factory, you probably think of a building with workers in it. But this Pao Chen factory is actually a city. At the time, it had 150,000 workers in it. And that city was divided into sectors. There was a Nike sector with, I think at the time, something like 21,000 workers. Next door to it was the Reebok sector with 12,000 workers. Every major brand was made in this complex, which was a fortification, with closed gates, you couldn't just walk in. And I should mention that Pouchen is a Taiwanese company. So think about this. You, the consumer, place an order with Nike, which is based in Beaverton, Oregon. Nike designs the shoes. It markets the shoes. It pays super athletes a fortune, so you think that you'll be just like those athletes when you buy the shoe. And then it goes around the world. In this case, it goes to South China, where it hires a factory owned by a Taiwanese business conglomerate to actually make the shoe. And its competitor Reebok is right next door in another part of this factory making its own shoes. And those shoes are then exported. And by the way, I've simplified the story because what happens in this factory is the shoes are assembled. But a complex running shoe has many, many different parts. It has plastics in it, it's got all sorts of stuff which are made all over the place. They wind up in this huge factory complex where they're then assembled and then sent back by container ship to Los Angeles in this case to be sold in your local sporting goods store. So this is how supply chain works in the world today. Now, when I was your age, 100 years ago, right, a long time ago, the world that I knew didn't work that way. The world that I knew was, the image was General Motors. General Motors, a huge car conglomerate, and raw materials went into a General Motors factory, and a car came out, and it was all made in Detroit. There are some parts that came from elsewhere in the U.S. and maybe some parts from Mexico, but basically the supply chain was local. Huge factory, many, many workers, and it was all, most of it was made in America. In today's supply chains, the brands, what we call the brands and the retailers like Walmart, don't actually make anything. Things that are made in independently owned factories, and those factories are around the world, and I'll tell you why that's important. When General Motors employed workers, when automobile workers went to work in a General Motors plant and punched their time card, General Motors was responsible for what happened to those workers. The workers wanted more money, and General Motors wouldn't come across. They had a union, the United Auto Workers. They would go on strike, and wages would eventually go up. And so when I was your age, ordinary working class people had their income go up because they were working for locally owned companies. Today, when Nike hires a factory in China, and it has factories in China, Indonesia, and elsewhere, to make its shoes, Nike has no legal responsibility for what happens in their factory. It's not that Nike doesn't care. As we'll see, they have a code of conduct that says the workers have to be treated decently and paid decently, and they have inspectors that go in to make sure it happens. But when things fall apart, Nike is not legally responsible for what goes, because the factory is not owned by Nike. It's owned by a Taiwanese businessman who is located in a factory in China. So it is very hard for workers to get redress for their problems. And the next series of slides will show you some of the problems there. So China, the world's factory, these are shots that I took inside this factory, this Pouchen factory in China. Young woman sewing insoles. There's actually a video of this all day long. This woman is doing this and this machine repeatedly over and over again. Now let me take you to Bangladesh, which, as the slide says, is the most dangerous place in the world to be a garment worker. So these are pictures that I actually took in the factory that I visited, which was one of the better factories in Bangladesh, since I could only go in with the permission of the Garment Owners Association. They made sure that I only got to see good factories. So in 2012, there's a factory that broke out of the Tazreen fashions in Bangladesh. Basically, it's an old story. The doors had been locked so workers couldn't get out, for fear that workers would be stealing goods, supposedly. Fire broke out, and 112 workers died in this factory. It was the worst industrial factory disaster, certainly in memory, certainly in Bangladesh, since a fire that actually happened in New York City. And 100 years earlier, in 2011, the Triangle Fire, which had young girls jumping out of upper story floors to escape a fire there. How many of you are familiar with this? The Rana Plaza collapse. Have you studied that at all?
Yeah.
Good. So you know the story. Mr. Rana, who is a well-connected factory owner, well-connected to local politics, basically had this building erected, I think 7 stories or something like that, on top of a 2-story building without benefit of a permit. And one day cracks appeared in the building. On the first floor of the building, which you can no longer see, which had shops and stores and restaurants, nobody went to work. But the workers who worked in a half a dozen factories, some 3,000 or 4,000 workers, in the upper floors, were told to go to work. They were told if they didn't go to work, they wouldn't get paid, and in fact, many of the factories had enforcers to make sure they went to work. Mr. Rana himself famously said this factory will stand for 100 years. 1 hour later, the factory collapsed, and actually the death toll ultimately was 1,138 workers, and thousands were injured. Amputations were formed on the spot to extract workers from the collapsed rubble. And that's another picture to give you a sense of this. That, I know that, it's hard to get behind a large number, like over 1,100 workers died, but try to imagine you're in the top floor of a building or an upper floor, you're working a sewing machine, there's suddenly a huge rumble and the whole thing collapses on you. Maybe you're killed instantly, maybe you're trapped under tons and tons of rubble. It was the worst industrial factory disaster that we know about in history. There have been worse disasters. Bhopal, India in the 1980s, where the Union Carbide plant emitted toxins that killed thousands of people. This is the worst factory disaster. And here are some of the companies whose labels were found in this building, although many denied it until the rubble was cleared, and the labels were found. Pretty much every major label that we buy, Walmart and the Gap, H&M, notably, on this factory. H&M, by the way, is now Bangladesh's major clothing producer, H&M. Well, you can't read this. So the solution is that companies like Nike or H&M have a code of conduct. And they will pin that code of conduct up in English and in whatever the local language is. And it says we'll pay a decent wage, we won't employ child labor, and so on. But those codes of conduct are voluntarily enforced. That means that a company like Nike will hire its own inspectors to go into the factory and report back to Nike. They're not public. These factories are not open to the public. So it's basically a trust me approach. And, the way I think of it is the old cliche, having the fox guard the chicken coop. If you have, well, none of you probably have ever had a chicken coop. But imagine you had a chicken coop and there are foxes that were trying to get at your chickens. None of us probably ever seen a fox either, so we could probably come up with a better example, but this is the best graphic I can find on the web. Would you have a fox guard the hen house? Would you have the companies that are using these factories themselves inspecting and reporting back on these factories? And I'll tell you why it doesn't work. It works when the workers have a voice. So in Bangladesh, after this factory collapse, workers went to the streets, demanded higher wages, and got a huge increase, an almost doubling of their wages. Because the workers themselves shut down the apparel industry, which accounts for 80% of all exports from Bangladesh. It's hugely important in the country's economy. After this collapse two agreements were made, which could be game-changing agreements. I'm going to sort of end with this. One is called the Accord on Fire and Building Safety. Now just bear with me for a moment. So basically the Accord, just to back up, so this tragedy was so huge over 2 years ago. It was in all the newspapers. It couldn't be ignored. And so the companies, which had been negotiating with local labor unions in Bangladesh, eventually were brought to the table, and led by H&M, they signed an agreement. And the agreement basically had a number of provisions, but here are the main ones. They agreed to make their factories safe. In other words, any factory that any company that signed the accord said, we will make these factories safe so they can't collapse, even if we have to pay for it. That was another agreement, because these were legally binding agreements. Remember what I said before, that brands have no legal responsibility for what happens in their independent factories. This is potentially a game changer, because for the first time, the companies that signed the accord said, we are legally responsible, we assume responsibility. It established the principle of joint liability, joint legal responsibility. And they said they would actually pay for it if the brands could. In other words, to make a building structurally safe, call for a system of inspections, and then investing billions of dollars to retrofit these factories to make them safe. And if the factories themselves couldn't do it, the brands said they would kick in. Over 200 companies have signed this agreement. Almost all of them are European companies. Every major brand and every major department store, retailer in Europe has signed this. Guess which companies wouldn't? Gap and Walmart. Gap and Walmart did not like the two provisions that I mentioned. One, it established a precedent to make them legally responsible for what happened, and they didn't like the fact that they might be held up for the cost of this. So they created their own agreement, something called the Alliance for Worker Safety, which called for inspections and called for fixing up the factories, but was not legally enforceable and didn't obligate Gap, Walmart, or the roughly 24 other U.S. firms that signed it to pay for anything. So that's sort of where we stand today. And we're now in the position of seeing 2 years later whether one or both of these is actually going to make a difference. But it is, I think, a hopeful step forward. So what can you do here? I'll end with this. Where can you buy decent clothing? Does American University, do you have a logoed shirt or anything like that? You do?
Rachel.
Where's the
It's Bella Canvas, so I'm not sure.
Well, I have a suggestion.
Everyone's wearing a hoodie.
And I don't have stock in this company, so I have no interest in this. So there's a company in Dominican Republic called Altagracia. It's called Altagracia because it's in the Altagracia Free Trade Zone in Dominican Republic. And for a variety of reasons, this factory has agreed to do the one thing that many colleges and universities have required of their items that have a logo on them. And that is to pay workers a living wage, not the minimum wage, but a wage they can live on, and to let the workers form a union and negotiate over wages and hours. Both of these things are pretty much unheard of anywhere in the world today. Just to give you sort of a one-sentence background, 200 colleges and universities across the United States and some in Canada have codes of conduct that require that anything which bears the UC Santa Barbara logo, for example, be made in a factory where workers are paid a living wage, which is typically 3 times the minimum wage in those countries, and be allowed to unionize. That's done almost nowhere except in the Altagracia factory. And now there are hundreds of colleges and universities in the U.S. that buy some of their merchandise from Altagracia.
Ours are made in the USA.
Pardon?
Ours are made in the USA.
I'll come back to that. So there my model. Your Alta Gracia hoodie. And just to show you what is possible, well, this isn't the best design, but. So with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.